Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends. Welcome to part 2 of our 6-part Eldritch Moon Full Set review. Today we're going to look at all of the blue cards in the set and a couple of the multicolor cards. Now yesterday we looked at all of the white cards, and we're just going to continue every day through the color pie. The last day we'll look at the colorless cards and hopefully give you some thoughts and impressions to help you with the pre-release once we get there. So having said that, we got a lot of cards to look at, and blue actually has some interesting limited archetypes. They do have a spirit style archetype that's going to be in the Azorius colors. There's an interesting Is It tempo deck that you could draft in here as well. And it also plays very well with black, which black's all about zombies in this set and graveyard recursion. Blue is the color that really helps fuel the self-mill for the graveyard. So there's a lot going on here, and let's start looking at the cards. First card is Advanced Stitchwing, and this is a fine limited card. There's not a whole lot to say about this, but for 5 you do get a 3/4 flyer. It is a zombie, which is going to work well in the black-blue builds in limited, and more importantly, however, it is a discard outlet, but you can return this from your graveyard to the battlefield, and blue has a lot of self-mill, so this is one of those cards that could get milled, but you're still going to find value and still have an opportunity to get it in play. Chilling Grasp. I always love these kind of cards. I'm a sucker for these like sleep effects and stuff. Chilling Grasp is a great limited card. It has Madness. Now it's interesting that the Madness costs a little more than the regular cost, and it's already an instant. So basically what that tells me is this is just a nice little bonus where you can pay this Madness cost to maybe get some value off of a discard, or perhaps if you're forced to discard, then you can still get a little bit of value out of this card. So it's upside. It's not a bad thing at all. And this is always a strong ability. This is going to be great for you in limited. It's going to especially be good in a tempo style deck like the Is It deck, but is really going to be good in probably any blue build in limited. Next we have Coax from the Blind Eternities, and this one's actually kind of a fun card. I mean, this is basically an Eldrazi Wish, and I think this is a card that kind of captures a lot of people's imaginations. So having said that, we're going to use this card. I think it has modern applications in perhaps Tron builds, because not only can you go and find an Eldrazi from your sideboard, but you can also find Eldrazi tribal spells, and there's some quite good ones that were printed back in Rise of the Eldrazi. So if you go back that far, you can find things like All Is Dust, for example. And I think a Tron deck would actually really benefit from being able to have this level of versatility to either pull something like an All Is Dust or just plain go and get Emrakul, right? So I think this will see play there. I also like the fact that they included that you can take something not only from outside the game, quote unquote, your sideboard usually, but also an exiled creature. So this makes it at least sideboard relevant in limited, because if you're playing against an opponent that has some exile effects and you play some Eldrazi, then this card actually may be something you want to board in. It's not just a dead rare in your pool, so I kind of like that they did that. Overall, this is a very good card. It will see play in certain places. Maybe it's a little niche. I think Commander, this will be fantastic, because in Commander you just have the opportunity to do crazy big things. This is a card that's going to help enable crazy big things. Next we have Contingency Plan, and this is another blue card that's doing exactly what blue wants to do in this set, and that's populate your graveyard. But it's interesting because it's also doing what blue typically likes to do, and that's go through the top of your deck and get some value out of the next few cards. Unfortunately, like some spells, this one doesn't let you put those cards in your hand, but that's still pretty good. You get to put the cards you want on top of your library. Everything else gets to go and fill your graveyard. So again, this is a card that's probably really meant for the black-blue archetype in limited. Don't really think it's going to see play outside of limited, but it might be fine in that archetype for you. Convolute. This is actually a reprint from the original Ravnica City of Guilds, and it was a good counterspell then. It's a good counterspell now. If your opponent's not playing around it, it's basically a counterspell for 3 with only 1 mana having to be on color. This is very strong. This will be great for you in limited. Don't hesitate to play these, especially if you're trying to be more controlling. This is going to be awesome in an Is It build, especially where you're trying to control and tempo out the game a little more. But this is good enough to see play in standard as well. I'm not sure exactly which deck will be looking for it, but I think eventually we'll get to the point where control and or tempo deck will get there in standard. I don't know if it's going to be now, but probably be post-rotation. But they've been sprinkling the pieces for the last few sets, and this set is starting to come out a little stronger with some strong control and tempo elements, and I think that's going to continue into the next block. Next we have Curious Homunculus, which transforms into Voracious Reader. And first off, I love the art. I love just the flavor of this card is amazing. But having said that, we're going to play this. It's going to be fine for you in limited if you're really kind of all in on this Is It Tempo deck. If you're drafting that deck, this will be a good card for you. If you're not drafting that deck, you're probably not going to be playing this card. I think this is also probably a tough card to get to work in most sealed pools, but it does have its place. Again, as far as standard goes, if that tempo deck or control deck can get into this metagame at some point, this card could be a part of it when that happens. Displace. It's another flicker effect. We saw some of these in white. They do work really well with certain cards in the environment, whether you're looking at cards from this set or cards just in standard in general. However, the only thing that's a little awkward about some of these flicker effects is, yes, they are versatile. They can do things like protect your creature from removal, but really, if you're thinking about standards, you're playing them because you want enters the battlefield effects. And there are good ones out there. There's things like Reflector Mage. But I just feel like they're a little inconsistent because it's the old problem of you draw all your flicker effects and none of your creatures. You draw all your creatures and none of your flicker effects. There's just a level of variance there, which I don't know you can get away with in this current standard meta because it's just so aggressive and so fast. Other metas you might have been able to whiff and still survive. I don't know about this one. If I'm going up against a white or a white-green token deck, just something super aggressive, I don't want to be sitting there with a Displace in my hand and a Reflector Mage, you know. So I just don't know if they're going to quite get there. Now, having said that, there is a flicker card coming up in a few minutes that I actually like, which potentially could be standard playable. But this one I think is going to be fine for you in limited, if nothing else. Docent of Perfection, which transforms into Final Iteration. First off, let me say I just love what they've done with the whole concept of the Delver of Secrets evolving over these sets. That's been awesome. This one is a huge flavor hit. I love the fly with the guy in the cage, just kind of a play off Delver of Secrets. And the final iteration where everybody's turning into flies. I mean, this is awesome. So, if nothing else, huge flavor win here. But it's a very good limited card for you. You pay 5 for a 5/4 flyer. That's good. And if you happen to have some instants and sorceries, hey, you know what? You get some additional value out of this card. So this will be fine for you there. I don't know if it's going to see much play outside of limited, but it is definitely good if you get this in your sealed pool or if you can pick one up and draft. Drag Under. Now, this is a return a creature to its owner's hand card, which I always like these. This one's at sorcery speed, though, so it's not quite as good. It can't protect your own creatures in a lot of situations, obviously, but you do cantrip off it, so that's a thing. So paying 3, you get a little tempo out of this, and it replaces itself. That would be just fine in some limited builds. Enlightened Maniac. I actually kind of like this card for limited. You pay 4, but you're getting 3/4 power toughness on the battlefield. That's actually pretty decent value. And the fact that the 0/2 human's probably not doing a whole lot, but at least it's a blocker. It can chump or something, or maybe you can sacrifice it for another effect. But the 3/2 colorless Eldrazi is a nice little beater for sure. Exalted Cultist. Well, I don't like paying 3 for a 2/2, but it does replace itself. Because of that, I do think it is limited playable. I wouldn't mind running this. It's a little creature. I feel like I'm overpaying slightly, but the fact that when it does die, I do get to draw a card makes it, I think, worth it. Fogwalker. This one's actually pretty cool because it's cheap. I mean, paying 2 for a 1/3 is very economical in limited. I like Skulk overall as an ability. Sometimes you just get a little bit of damage in throughout the game, which is kind of nice. And the fact that when this enters the battlefield, you can tap down a creature is a nice little tempo play as well, and it stays tapped for a turn. So this is a great limited card. I'd like to play this, and it's a spirit, so keep that in mind if you're drafting that spirit deck, especially the Azorius spirit deck, which there's a lot of good synergies there. Spirits in general, I feel like they're on the cusp of being standard playable. I think in a lot of other metas they would have got there. Again, it's just such a aggressive meta that they're competing with some very aggressive tribal builds like humans. So I think that's held them back a little bit, but it's still a good archetype. It's a great archetype for limited. Next, we have Fortune's Favor, and this is maybe one of my favorite cards of the set. Not necessarily because of power level. Obviously, there's a higher level of variance here than many cards like this. It's obviously no Factor Fiction, but I love the art. I love the flavor. I love the fact that this is a fun card. You can play this card, and you're going to have a good time, right? It's actually pretty good and limited. Like I said, I know it's no Factor Fiction, but if you're in the Dimir deck and you're trying to fill your graveyard, this is actually pretty good, because worst case scenario, it cycles and you get some stuff in your graveyard. That's actually not bad, especially in that deck. Believe it or not, I think this might even be standard playable. I know it has a high level of variance, but again, the fact that it fuels the graveyard is going to be really good for the zombie deck. And I do think there'll be a standard zombie deck, and it's going to be black, probably mostly, maybe with a little bit of blue, and this could potentially get there. Also, fantastic in Commander. I mean, imagine playing this with a group of people watching. It's just going to be fun. I love that they designed a card like this. This is incredible. I hope we see more stuff like this in the future. Geist of the Archives. Don't be fooled by this one. It seems innocuous. This is a 0/4 defender for 3. But the fact that you can scry every upkeep is actually very, very powerful. This is a good card. It's also a spirit, so that could matter in certain situations. However, this is just a great blue card for limited as well as potentially standard. I'm not really sure where it's going to fit in standard. Again, it could be part of a control deck in the future or a tempo deck in the future. If not now, maybe post-rotation. But these scry effects, we've seen them in the past with like Sigil Starfish. Now this one costs a little more, unfortunately, but they can be very, very powerful, especially for a control deck. So keep an eye on this one. I think eventually it will make its way into standard, if not right now. And it's going to be awesome for you in limited, no matter what build you're in. I love effects like this. Grizzled Angler, which transforms into Grizzly Anglerfish. This is good in certain limited builds. You kind of have to know your deck. First off, you want a deck where you're trying to populate your graveyard, which of course can be the Dimir deck, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, there's also delirium effects in all colors. I mean, it could be a Simic deck even, you could find value there. But you also need to have some of those colorless Eldrazi cards in your deck, or at least one or two to hopefully hit, to transform this to really get the true value out of it in some cases. So it's not going to always make your build, but it's going to be good sometimes. If you do transform this, it can actually be very strong as long as you have some creatures on the board and some decent board state in your favor, because you can force your opponent to attack into some unprofitable blocks and then hopefully strike back and perhaps win the game. So it has the potential to be powerful. It's just not going to be great in all decks. Identity Thief. Now, this is the card with the flicker effect that I mentioned earlier that I feel like could be standard playable. The reason I like this a little better than some of the sorceries and instants we've seen is just simply because this is reusable, and that can get kind of crazy kind of quick. Now, the one strike against this card, though, I think is its casting cost. 2 blue and 2 might be a little tough in, say, Bant decks to cast, and like Bant Collected Company decks are probably the decks that want to play something like this. But basically, any deck where you can flicker Reflector Mage repeatedly, this is going to be good, right? So the only issue, again, is we're right now in a very hyper-aggressive, cheap standard format. That could hold this card back a little bit, so maybe we'll see it more post-rotation, but I do think that it's still a very good card and has a lot of potential as is right now. Having said that, it's also very good for you in limited, and this is a great commander card when you have a lot of targets on the board. Imprisoned in the Moon. This one's very interesting to me because this is quote-unquote blue removal, and a little bit stronger than what we've seen in recent history, and maybe ever in blue. Blue's all about, counter spells, tempo, bounce, combat tricks to get rid of creatures. This is just a flat out, your creature, land, or planeswalker is now just a land that taps for mana. And that's something we haven't really seen from blue before. And because of that, this is going to see, I think, extensive play. I think this is modern playable. I think this is actually vintage and possibly legacy playable. Just the fact that it can shut down such a wide variety of threats, and it's in blue, which is a big plus in Eternal formats. It plays well with Force of Will, and even in Vintage. I mean, you could play this turn 1 and shut down even a Mishra's Workshop. That's kind of good, I think. So, yeah, watch out for this one. I think this will see a lot of play in a lot of places. And needless to say, yes, it will see standard play. And it's going to be awesome for you in limited if you happen to get this. And great commander card, too. Ingenious Scab. This is a good limited card. I love these limited beaters with the +1/-1 effect. This one even has prowess on top of it, so it works very well not only in the zombie deck because it's a zombie, but it also works well in the tempo deck, the Izzet deck. So I like this a lot. It's a common. You'll see a bunch of these floating around. It's going to fit into a couple archetypes. Laboratory Brute, another card that's going to fuel your graveyard for Dimir. However, it's also a nice beater. Paying 4 for a 3/3 is going to be just fine for you in limited. Lunar Force, another interesting card. This one reminds me a lot of Hesitation, which came out in Stronghold, but that card was a blue and 1, I believe, and the difference was it worked on all players, including yourself. So when you put that out, even if you cast a spell, it would have been countered. This one is just your opponent's, but you pay 1 more for it. This is a very interesting tempo card. Now, sure, your opponent can play around this to some effect due to the fact that they know the next thing they're going to play is going to be countered. So they can play something they don't care about or something they want to get in their graveyard, or they can just play something cheap to get around this. But it still slows them down. It slows them down enough that a tempo deck, a good tempo deck, can take advantage of it. This could see some play in standard at some point. I think this might even possibly see some modern play, and it's a good card for you in limited. Try it out. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. If you've ever played the Hesitation before, you kind of know how that can slow down a game. I think this will have a similar effect. Mausoleum Wanderer. Speaking of cards that slow down a game, this is another good example. This is a 1-drop, and the fact that at any time you can sack it to potentially force your opponent to pay more for an instant or sorcery is decent. I think this would have been a little bit better if it was just any spell. But if your opponent is playing instants and sorceries or a fair amount of them, it's a good card to sideboard in. Say you're up against like that Izzet tempo deck or something in limited. It could be decent for you there. It's also a cheap flyer that also is a spirit and combos with spirits, so it makes sense in the Azorius deck. So this is a card, it's not always going to make your build. Sometimes it's just a good sideboard card, but if you're in the spirit deck in limited, it could be good there too. Again, if some point the spirit deck makes it into standard, this will definitely be part of it. Mind's Dilation. This is a commander card, and it's a big, kind of expensive, flashy mythic, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is going to be a lot of fun in commander when you have a lot of opponents to be able to affect with this. Granted, it might put a target on your back, but it's still a very interesting, kind of fun card. Is it still okay to play in limited? It's okay, and it's a little expensive. It's probably going to whiff at least once or twice. But when it does hit, it's going to feel good. It's not always going to make your build, but if you're just looking for something at the top end of your curve, I mean, it's playable. Neblast Herald. Another really good and aggressive spirit to go in the Azorius deck. Not only does it have flying, but it has flash. 2/1 for 3 feels a tad expensive, but I'm okay with that considering it's a flyer, and the fact that it's also tapping down creatures not only when it comes into play, but any other spirit comes into play under your control. So this is definitely good enough for limited, if nothing else. Nice little flyer, and it's a good way to get damage across in that spirit deck. Niblis of the Frost. Here's another amazing spirit, actually, and this is a little unusual because this is a intro deck rare, which typically they're good limited cards, but not much more than that. This one potentially, I think, could be standard playable. Not even just a spirit build, but I think this could just be in a deck that's playing blue. The fact that this is a 3/3 flyer for 4, those are pretty good stats. It has prowess on top of it, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it taps something down and doesn't untap next time around. This card just does so much. So I do think potentially you could get there in standard. I think that this is incredible in limited. This is just a huge limited bomb. If you happen to get this, you'll be very, very happy to play it there. Scour the Laboratory. Here's another really good blue card. Now, first off, it looks expensive. Okay, 6 to draw 3 cards. That seems a little pricey, especially in a world where we lived in with Treasure Cruise for so long, right? But look a little closer. This is an instant. That's a huge deal. And secondly, if you get Delirium, now it's at a concentrate level casting cost, which seems a lot more affordable, right? This is a strong card. This will see standard play. This could potentially see modern play, and there's not a lot of great card draw spells in modern that haven't been banned. So this potentially could get there in the right deck, and it's going to be awesome for you in limited. Watch out for this one. It looks a little innocuous. It's just really easy to write off a 6 casting cost spell at first glance, but you really have to think of this as a 4 casting cost spell, and just remember, this is an instant. That's a big deal. Spontaneous Mutation, nice little combat trick for blue and limited. It's blue's way of removing creatures or dealing with a big problematic threat, at least for a turn. Obviously, it gets better if you have stuff in your graveyard, so it might play well in the Dimir deck. Not always going to make your cut, but it's fine if you need this. Summary Dismissal. This is another very powerful and surprising blue card. We haven't seen anything like this in quite some time. Actually, we've never seen anything quite like this. First off, exile all other spells. Spells with an S. So that means anything on the stack you can exile. Notice it's exile and not counter. Deals with cards that can't be countered, like Abrupt Decay, so on and so forth, Supreme Verdict, all of that. Also, it counters all abilities. So abilities, things like storm abilities, things like fetch land activation, you could counter with this. So if you've ever played with Stifle in Legacy, you know how surprising and how effective a card like Stifle can be. Now granted, Stifle is a lot cheaper than this, but this does something that we really haven't seen in a long time. This is a very, very powerful card. It not only does it deal with storm, it deals with just so many random threats out there. It's a great tempo card at times if you just want to slow your opponent down who's trying to use a fetch land. Could take them off their mana potentially. This card, watch out for this one. It's going to see play in modern. I don't know if it's necessary in Legacy because you have Stifle and you have Flusterstorm, so you might not need this card there, but it's definitely going to be good in modern. This will see some standard play at some point, I'm pretty sure, and it will still be good for you in limited if nothing else. Is just kind of a counter spell, but this is a very interesting card. It's going to have huge impact, I think, on Commander. I think Commander decks that are trying to do big things, especially go off with combos and stuff, this is a way to shut some of those down. It's very, very strong card. This is going to be great. You may even want to think about picking up your foils of this early. I think it's going to see a lot of play. Next we have Take Inventory, another very strong blue card. Blue's just really getting a nice push that we haven't seen in a little while for this color. And Take Inventory is a card that I think we'll see play in Standard. It's one of those cards that the first time you play it, it's not very impressive. It's cycling. But the second one is a little better. The third one is great. It just gets better the longer the game goes, and that's what a control deck is trying to do, right? Also, it plays very well with the fact that blue is fueling its graveyard with a lot of the cards that you see in this set. So having said that, this will be great for you in limited. This will definitely see standard play at some point, and I think it could see modern play, if nothing else, just because, again, a lot of the draw spells in modern have been banned, so this one is decent. It's a good one. It might show up in some random builds. Ederd Haunter. This is a nice little aggressive flyer for blue. You don't see that very often. This reminds me a little bit of Vampire Interloper from the first Innistrad. But you get yourself a nice little 2/1 flyer for 2 in blue. It's a spirit on top of that. Granted, it can only block creatures with flying, but that's fine. This is really about getting in for some early damage. That's going to work really well, especially in the Azorius Spirit deck. And again, if Spirit decks can get there in Standard at some point, I think this could be part of that deck, just to get the early damage across. Turn Aside. This is a good sideboard card. It's cheap, only costs 1. You can board this in if your opponent has a lot of removal, and there's some good removal in the set. We'll definitely see it as we move into black and red, so it will be good there. I think it could be a good sideboard card in Standard as well, and potentially even modern. Unsubstantiate. Here's yet another really push blue card in my opinion. This has shades of Remand, but it actually behaves in a little bit of a different way. So you get to return target spell or creature to its owner's hand. So there's some versatility there. If you have to deal with a problematic spell and kind of tempo that, wonderful. If you need to tempo out a creature, you can do that instead. Now, having said that, again, here's another card that lets you deal with things like Abrupt Decay, Supreme Verdict. It's a nice way to tempo those cards a little bit. So because of that, I think this will see some Legacy play. I think this will see Modern play. And it's definitely good enough to see Standard play in the right deck, especially a Controller Tempo style deck. And yeah, it's going to be good for you in Limited too. Great card. Next we have Wharf Infiltrator. Now, this is a innocuous looking card, but I think there's a lot of potential here. It costs 2 for a 1/1. That's not super exciting. It's got Skulk, and when it does damage, it loots. Okay, starting to feel a little better. But whenever you discard a creature card, it doesn't have to be from the loo, but whenever you discard a creature card, you can pay 2 and get a 3/2 Eldrazi token. There's a lot of value from cards in the graveyard in this set in Shadows over Innistrad. There's creatures that can do things from the graveyard, whether they can return from the graveyard or be returned to your hand with another card or simply be exiled for an effect. There's a lot that you can do with these creatures, and if you can pitch them to get 3/2 tokens and then still get value out of them, there is something to be said about that. So having said that, could someone brew something up here that could be interesting for Standard? Perhaps. I think there's a brew here. I think we just need to find it. It's also a great limited card if you can kind of build around it a little bit. It's actually a nice build around card. There's a lot of good cards you can pick up that just are going to interact extremely well with this. There's a card we're going to look at in green in a couple days, which is a lot like Wild Mongrel, which is actually a discard effect that's a plus for the creature. It gives it +1/+1. Imagine pitching a creature, you give another creature +1/+1, pay 2, get yourself a 3/2, and then you still get some sort of effect, or maybe you can return that creature that you pitch back to your hand. It could get out of hand pretty quick. Watch for this card. Watch for it to show up in Standard potentially, but watch for it in your drafts, and I think it could do some interesting things in Commander too. Alright, let's move on to some multicolor cards and look at Gissa and Giraffe. This is a mythic. Now, this is doing everything the Dimir deck wants to do in this environment. It's going to help populate your graveyard, and then you can cast zombies directly from your graveyard. This is fantastic. I think there will be a zombie deck in Standard. I know I mentioned that earlier. This will definitely be a part of it. This is going to be a nice 4-drop for that deck. Also, this is going to be great for you in Limited, especially if you can maybe draft some zombies, of course, to play along with it. But if nothing else, it's still a 4/4 for 4. You don't see that a lot in blue and black. They usually don't get 4/4s for 4. So even if you're not using the ability at all, that's still very economical for you in Limited, especially in those colors. I really like that a whole lot. This is a great card. This is also fantastic for Commander. I think that goes without saying. This can be a Commander, can make this a Commander for your zombie deck and have probably some very good results there. Fantastic card. I really love it, and it's a big flavor hit too with these characters. Alright, last card of the day is Mercurial Geists. And this one, it is a spirit, so that's a good thing if you're trying to pick up some spirits, but this one's not super exciting for me. 1/3 flyer. Obviously, this is better in a control or tempo style deck, but what's a little awkward about this thing is it pumps its power but not its toughness, and it doesn't have trample or something like that. So granted, it does have flying, that's nice, but the problem here is it can be blocked and killed by a flyer. It can easily be taken out with direct damage. 2 small flyers can take the thing out. So really, are you getting a whole lot of value out of it for 4 mana? I don't know. It just doesn't feel super economical to me. Playable in Limited, definitely playable, especially if you draft that Izzet tempo deck. It actually is a nice way to get damage across other than burn, for example. So it will be fine for you there, but other than that, it's not super exciting. So having said that, those are all the blue cards. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll look at all the black cards. And like I said, we'll continue through the color pie and get through the whole set. So, hey, until then, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day.
Hey, thanks as always for watching. This video, like all my videos, was made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Even a donation of $1 helps me to keep growing this community and creating better quality videos for all of you. Check out our Patreon page for exclusive giveaways and future goals for the channel. If you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the MTG news, spoilers, set reviews, product openings, or finance videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a good day.